And immediately afterwards, another team member added, "Yeah, Grid, who are you to look down on us?" Immediately after these words, Grid heard a beggar without any accessory in his address. He will run away at the first opportunity, I am sure. He is lying about the level. If you have nothing noble in you, then show at least a little altruism first. You must show altruism. Continuing to hint to the boy that he was being too arrogant, one of the group members heard someone behind him say, "Hey, enough already." Looking back, the man said in surprise, "Mr. Regas." When everyone paid attention to him and quieted down, Regas said confidently, "Since our guild is taking responsibility for the boss, we can leave the rest of the work to him." Seeing the famous guy near him, one of the people on the square was surprised to say, "Wow, it's really Regas from the Sadak Guild. I've never seen him before." And his friend was surprised to hear him say that. Without taking his eyes off Regas, the surprised man said the first place in the martial arts ranking. His username is Master Taekwondo. The restrictions for equipment items are very strict, so it is quite difficult to raise the level, but he has already reached the level. At the same time, Grid, who was looking at Regas, thoughtfully said that the ranker was looking so good on his own and was really very unfair. Hearing that he was ready to accept the braggart into the team, the nervous man said, "Mr. Rega, even if you like someone, there must be some limits to it. You can't just take a stranger in." Ignoring his subject's warning, Regas pointed to Grid, who was standing behind him, and said, happily, "The more people, the easier it is to clear the neighborhood. Isn't that right?" Rejoicing at the naivety of Rega, who was really ready to accept him into his team, Grid smiled slyly and said in his head, "Boogaloo, a good guy despite his appearance." Hearing the proposal from his commander, Tobin replied thoughtfully, "I understand what you mean, but can we convince the others?" Grid smiled slyly and said in his head, "Uh-oh, better listen to what the runner is saying." After hearing the proposal from his subject, Regas happily said, "Okay, then let's have a one-on-one match to test his abilities. As soon as we prove his control skills, the problem will disappear immediately, right?" Hearing this suggestion from Rega, Grid turned his head away and began to sweat coldly and thought, "Well, now I'm definitely screwed." At the same time, Rega, warming up for the fight, said happily, "Well, let's get started." Hearing his commander's proposal, Tobin smiled happily and said, "By the way, it's a great idea. I'm sure everyone will agree with it after the battle." No sooner had he finished speaking than Grid kicked his slippers, exclaiming, "Oh God, this is boring. I have to work on my left foot control, boogeyman." Seeing a potential member of his team run away, Regas said in surprise, "I don't understand why he ran away. I think we would have worked well together." Continuing his escape from Rega and his team, Grid nervously said in his head, "Damn, I thought everything went wrong. First, I need to earn money for the wheelchair." Arriving back at the same place where he was creating his unique item, Grid saw a system notification that said, "Please name the item you created." Looking at the sword he had created and the ribbon with the name on it, Grid thoughtfully said, "Why bother with this damaged item? But now I get the point." Having finally realized the true nature of his skill, Grid confidently said in his head, "Creation has a limited number of slots, so they should only be used in special cases. From now on, I will be busy earning money for the trip and learning how to create items." Naming his first created sword after the bug, Grid mentally said, "And this is just the beginning." After a while, the boy went in search of a forge where he could earn some money, going to Smith's forge and announcing his request. Grid immediately heard the answer from the doorway, "Go away from here," without realizing what it was. The boy was surprised to ask again and heard again in an angry tone, "Shut up and go away." Smith looked up from his work and said to Grid, "The blueprints for the item are good sellers. Know your place, pup. You dare to look down on blacksmiths." The blacksmith continued to do his work and said confidently, trying to drive the impudent man out of his forge, "Today's youth doesn't even know the basics and only wants to make money." Hearing such words from the blacksmith, Grid, trying not to accidentally offend the blacksmith again, said awkwardly, "There is nothing unusual about this, please, just this time." Hearing Grid's request, Smith, again dissatisfied with this attitude, said, "You are not the first to underestimate us, so I will tell you this." Looking back after these words to look Grid in the eyes, Smith said, "Those who look down on other people and their property are all the same. They have not done anything worthwhile with their own hands in their entire lives." Immediately after these words, the blacksmith looked away from Grid again and said, "Now don't waste my time and just get out of here so I don't have to see you." Leaving Smith's forge, Grid leaned against one of its walls and said disappointedly, "I'm completely screwed, and this was my only way to earn money for the trip." Shedding tears, I leaned against Smith Grid's forge and said in disappointment, "Am I really going to die in this town?" Hearing Grid's compassionate words, who was complaining about his life, Smith came out of the forge and said, "I can't even tell you to go and die." Immediately after these words, Smith threw one of the logs that was in his forge into Grid's hands and said, "Don't disturb the neighbors with your crying at my wall. Go and chop some wood for me." After receiving the first task from the blacksmith, Grid saw a system notification in front of him that said firewood harvesting e-chop units of firewood reward for completing plus experience plus bronze coins. Arriving in the backyard, Grid picked up an axe and thoughtfully said, "It's been a while since I had a normal task, and with this task alone I can raise my level." Immediately after these words, Grid rubbed the axe in his hands and added disappointedly, "But in this game you can potentially fail simply by chopping wood too realistically. I wonder if the subject evaluation will help me." After applying his evaluation skill to the axe, Grid saw system notifications that said, "You have evaluated the old axe level normal strength attack power." The next moment, Grid saw another system notification that said, "Your knowledge of the old axe has been reached. You have learned to create an item, old axe." Seeing this, the boy was impressed and said, "Wow, that was a first." Immediately after mastering the axe, Grid said thoughtfully, "But theoretical knowledge is different from practical knowledge." So the next moment he took the axe in both hands and prepared to chop. Noticing a red line on the log he was to chop, the boy wondered why I should hit that spot. Swinging his working tool exactly along the line that was marked on the log, Grid noticed how it easily broke into two pieces. Then he happily said in his head, "Wow, with one blow of knowledge, it's just incredible." Continuing to chop the logs one by one, the boy joyfully exclaimed, "If I achieve the knowledge of the legendary subject, I will soon be successful. I will chop all this wood at once." But after Grid started the task of chopping the logs, 2 hours had already passed, and by then the boy was lying on the ground exhausted. Unable to continue with the task he had been assigned, Grid said in frustration, "Damn my stamina. I only managed to chop 150 pieces of wood." Gathering his thoughts and his last strength, Grid, who realized that this was not going to work, got to his feet and reached for his axe, saying heavily, "I have to do my best." Setting to work again because he had a goal, Grid mentally told me that if I wanted to escape this city, I had to be patient a little longer. Continuing to convince himself that he had to fulfill this assignment under any circumstances, Grid continued to chop logs and said in his head, "Just be patient one more time, just one more time." After chopping another log after his stamina was at 0, Grid received a system notification stating that the stamina characteristic was open. Feeling relief all over his body after receiving the system notification, Grid wondered what the hell was that notification that just came to me. Looking at the new ability Grid received, he saw in its description that you don't get tired so easily. The maximum weight of the user's equipment has been increased. The duration of the feeling of saturation has increased for every 10 points of data to the resistance characteristic perseverance increases. By seeing this, Grid exclaimed in amazement, "Wow, this is a legendary skill." Holding the axe with only one hand, Grid said in amazement, "And no wonder I felt the fatigue disappear, as if I had become several years younger." Feeling a sudden burst of energy, Grid confidently said, wiping the sweat from his face, "I'll be fine. I'll get this done." Having worked hard, Grid cut down all the logs in the backyard and was finally able to sit down to rest after a hard day's work. After a while, the blacksmith Schmidt came to Grid and said in surprise, "You cut 1,000 pieces of firewood in 6 hours." Upon hearing this, the boy replied that it was easy. Trying not to show his stoma after hard and fruitful work, Grid confidently said, "I am a blacksmith despite my appearance." Hearing such self-confident words from the guy who came to him for the drawings, the blacksmith said, "I wonder how such a weakling could be a blacksmith and still be a blacksmith." Immediately after that, Smith handed Grid a pickaxe and said, "If you successfully complete this task, then I will believe you." Immediately after these words, a system notification appeared in front of the guy, which said Iron Ore Mining E, add units of iron ore reward for completion, plus units of blacksmith experience plus. Seeing the reward of experience points for the task, Grid smiled happily and mentally said, "Experience points will bring me back to the level," and then exclaimed, "I agree." Accepting the task from the blacksmith, Grid headed to the mine where he could get it. Arriving at the place and leaning on the pick from the stoma, the boy mentally said the same thing to himself, thinking that only a 30-minute walk took me hours. My energy was exhausted from simple movements. Tired from the long walk from the forge to the fossils, Grid mentally said to himself, leaning on the pick, "My level is at a disadvantage and I'm wearing 70th level gear. No wonder I'm moving so slowly. I want to take it off right now." After collecting his thoughts and regaining his strength, Grid walked over to one of the miners who was present in the mine and said in a tired voice, "Excuse me, I'm here to get iron ore for Mr. Smith." Hearing what a weak-looking boy was doing here, one of the miners turned to his friend and pointed a finger at Grid and said with derision, "Wow, but look at him. He says Smith sent him here. What's wrong with this bony fellow?" Talking loudly enough for Grid to hear, the boy had to listen to them discuss him in a haughty tone, saying, "I think he's only going to be a nuisance. We're too busy to deal with you right now." After a few minutes of discussing Grid's physique, one of the miners pointed to one of the seats and said, "Don't distract us for now. You can go to that corner and repeat after us." Watching Grid stare at the steel ore fossil, one of the miners said thoughtfully, "Smith did send this guy over to us, even though we were too busy to teach anyone else and would need to talk to him." However, their discussion and mockery of the boy did not last long. As soon as Grid started working with the pickaxe, his work impressed all the miners who were at the mine. With just a few blows on the wall, Grid was able to get a lot of iron ore fragments that other miners had to work for hours to get. Seeing that this guy's results were simply incredible, one of the miners said in surprise that since when iron ore was so easy to extract, to which the other replied that he was still wearing armor. At the same time, Grid, who was mining the iron ore in the fossils, mentally said, "My body is about to break down, but my mind is still pure." Remembering Smith's words when he told him not to waste your time and mine. "Get out of here," Grid added in his head. "I can't say he was wrong, but I can't say he was wrong." Continuing to work at the same pace to fulfill the order and complete the task assigned to him, Grid mentally said to himself, "This persistence of mine is in vain." Seeing how much iron ore Grid was producing, even with his method, one of the miners said in awe, "I must admit he is incredible." To which his friend replied that I would have to apologize to him for what I said. His talent and ability to extract large amounts of ore, even despite his rather low physical characteristics, one of the miners said confidently. He was particularly confident that one day he would be able to become a great miner. After receiving a system notification after a certain time of his work that said, "You have received 170 units of iron ore," Grid decided that he would stop there. Breathing heavily and dripping with sweat after his hard work, Grid nervously said in his head, "Perseverance is my personal weapon." Returning back to Smith and handing him all the iron ore he had dug up, Grid received twice as many experience points and coins for completing his task. Then sitting down in the backyard and opening the status window, Grid saw a system notification that said the basic characteristics of the Pagma descendant had been activated. Looking at his characteristics, which he had gained again, returning his level to the initial one, Grid happily said, "Finally, I'm back to the first level." Looking at the status window with the distributed points, Grid said thoughtfully, "Usually, the first level should have characteristic points, but the descendant of Pagma has them if you count the resistance that was created earlier and the additional points in irresistibility. They are." Seeing the extra characteristic points that he had at his disposal, Grid said in surprise that 40 characteristic points are given for each level. But why do I have them? Immediately after these thoughts, Grid began to go through various options in his head as to how this could have happened, and suddenly it dawned on him, and he mentally said, "It's unbelievable," realizing who it was that stood before him. The blacksmith, who had been strict for some time, grabbed his cheeks and said awkwardly, "Just think, I was so rude to such a prominent person, I am so embarrassed." Looking at Smith's behavior, Grid felt uncomfortable, but after completing this mission, his closeness with Smith increased by a point and his reputation in the town of Byron increased by a point. Clinging to Grid's hand, Smith nervously said, "Come on, don't be mad at me, we're both blacksmiths." To which Grid nervously replied, "Stay away from me." Having unhooked the blacksmith from him, Grid nervously said, "Please recommend me better things that I can sell. I need money for the journey." Hearing such words from the boy, the blacksmith looked back and said confidently, "Well, in that case I have something specially for you." Taking out an arrow from the chest behind him, Smith said confidently, "I have just prepared something special for you. Look, it's a Jaffa arrow." Looking at the arrow that the blacksmith held out to him, Grid said in surprise that these were ordinary arrows. You know that cheap consumables don't bring much money, and the blacksmith replied that this was no ordinary arrow. It was made of an alloy of steel and Jaffa. Having said that this item is not ordinary, the blacksmith confidently added its effect is to ignore some of the opponent's defensive skills. It is indispensable in raids against such strong golems as the Forest Guardian. Hearing the main characteristics of the arrow that the blacksmith handed him, Grid said thoughtfully, "Well, this radically changes the essence of the matter. I can immediately evaluate it." After analyzing the item Grid received from the blacksmith, he saw in its description, "Jaffa arrow, price 6 silver rating. Normal attack power weight. G. Your knowledge of the Jaffa arrow is equal. You can skillfully use the Jaffa arrow." Seeing that his recognition and study of the subject did not comprehend, Grid said in surprise 89, "And if I improve my knowledge by analyzing the arrow, will I be able to understand how to make it?" Hearing that he was interested in the structure and creation of the object given to him, Smith said awkwardly, "I will teach you how to make it." Hearing this, Grid turned his attention to the blacksmith and nervously wondered in his mind why his face was so colored. Having melted the furnace to the right temperature, the blacksmith took a shovelful of iron ore and shoveled it inside, saying, "First melt the ore in the blast furnace, then take out the iron ore and iron impurities." Pouring the finished molten iron into a vessel, Smith added that by cooling the molten iron, you will get pig iron that is not suitable for weapons. So to prevent this, you need to reduce the amount of carbohydrates by smelting. Having completed the main preparatory processes, the blacksmith continued, wiping the sweat from his face. "And now the smelting process begins. Perhaps you can try it yourself with Jaffa ore, although it is a bit difficult to calculate the correct proportion of minerals." Hearing what kind of work he was entrusted with, Grid put on his protective gloves and said confidently that it was worth at least a try. Recalling all the actions of the blacksmith who taught him, Grid mentally said as he threw ore into the furnace, "I carefully watched the blacksmith work. Although satisfy is quite realistic, but the knowledge is quite easy to obtain." The next moment, guided by the hints that appeared from time to time, Grid said in his head, "In addition, I have the effect of class compensation. These arrows indicate the direction and strength of the blacksmith's swings. Fanning the furnace to straighten out the Jaffa, Grid added in his head, "It didn't take 5 minutes for the furnace to fire up." And immediately afterwards, the boy received a system notification that said, "Pagma's descendant is temperature sensitive. You are accurately measuring the temperature in the furnace." As Grid continued to fan the furnace, he could see a new notification pop up above him with a temperature reading, and he was amazed to see that I could see a notification window with an accurate temperature. Noticing that the metal began to melt and drain into the vessel for the molten material, Grid joyfully exclaimed in his head, "I did it!" Without restraining his emotions, the boy joyfully exclaimed, "I did it!" And at the same time, Smith, who was standing behind him and breathing heavily with excitement, said, "You are so beautiful and sexy." Hearing these words from the blacksmith, Grid jumped away from the man in fright and nervously exclaimed, "Stop scaring me," to which Smith replied, "Even without experience in swimming, it's just incredible." Looking at Grid, Smith was impressed by his talents and said, "You're not just talented, it's as if Pagma himself was reborn." Hearing these words from his mentor, Grid mentally said not reborn but received a descendant. After obtaining the desired alloy, Smith took the molten material and began to pour it into molds, saying, "Now you need to make the tips, mix and heat the molten metal and then pour it into the mold." After some time had passed, Smith broke the mold for the arrowheads and said, "In 40 seconds, the metal will harden and you will get a similar tip, and then we go to the anvil." Holding the arrowhead with tongs and working on it with a hammer, Smith added, "While you're hitting it with the hammer, remember to balance it on the back side and polish the edges well." Having finished shaping the arrowhead, Smith looked to see if the work was done correctly, adding that in the end you would have to place the tip on the arrowhead to improve the penetration. You would have to guess with the balance of the weight. Throwing the finished arrow to Grid, which he had just made himself, the blacksmith said happily, "Well, do you think you can do it?" Immediately after receiving the finished arrow, after all the teachings and instructions, Grid received a system notification that said, "You have learned the Jaffa arrow study method." Then he confidently replied, "Of course." Immediately after that, Grid received the next system notification, which said that your knowledge of Jaffa arrows has reached. As soon as the blacksmith heard Grid's answer, he confidently said, "For the first time, the materials are free. Start, and I will look after you." As Smith watched Grid work with the molten metal, trying to replicate what he had done, he thought to himself, "He's no ordinary guy. He's handling the molten metal like a pro." Deciding to help his student a little, Smith said awkwardly, "I'm sorry I didn't teach you how to make an arrow shaft. I'll make them for you while the metal cools." Hearing the blacksmith's offer of help, Grid confidently said, "No, that's not necessary. I can do it myself." Recalling his skills, which also included the study of the Jaffa arrow, Grid confidently said in his head, because of his absolute knowledge, another way of obtaining it was added to me. I was just watching all the time, but I still improved my knowledge. Continuing to do the work of creating arrows, the guy confidently said in his head, "Now, this list is quite short, but the time will come and it will be filled to the brim. It is quite possible to do it yourself." Continuing to control the vessel for the molten metal, Grid mentally said to align the curved parts and add feathers with glue after cutting. When he finished making the arrow shafts, Grid said in his head, "The efficiency is amazing thanks to my skill and the compensation effect." Seeing that Grid had done it himself, even without being taught, Smith was amazed and said, "It's just incredible. You made them after watching me. Wait, what's this?" After preparing water to cool the arrows, Grid heard from the blacksmith, "What are you doing? Why are you cooling the tips? They won't be strong, although they will become more rigid." Hearing these words from his mentor, Grid confidently said, "Don't worry about it, I'm going to harden them." Smith was surprised to learn of his student's intentions and said, "You even know about hardening, but it's not usually done with consumables, and you don't have enough time to create a large number of arrows like this." As soon as Grid listened to the nuances of his plan, he confidently said, continuing to fulfill his plans, "If I make them better, I can sell them for a higher price." Continuing to do his work on creating and improving the Jaffa arrows, Grid mentally said, "If even a nobody like me can be successful." Picking up a pair of tongs and beginning to toughen the edges of the arrows, Grid confidently said, "I just have to do it like this." Having completed the hardening of the arrow, Smith saw the result of the work and said confidently, "Now just put the tip in, boy. You really have a great talent." Looking at the finished arrow, Grid mentally said, "Actually, this is all very exciting. All I've been doing these days is working hard. I never would have thought I would get so much pleasure from the work." Gathering the finished object into a single whole, Grid said thoughtfully, "I have completed the creation of the arrow. Now the task must be completed before he could finish speaking, as he saw a strange effect of the arrow flickering in his hands. The next moment, he could see a system notification in front of him that said the breath of the legendary Blacksmith was activated, and immediately after that, the arrow was enveloped in a purple aura that illuminated it. Not understanding what exactly was happening to his creation that he had just made, Grid nervously exclaimed what was going on here. Immediately after these words, everything became clear. A system notification appeared in front of him, stating that the task was completed. All characteristics were raised due to the creation of an epic item. Your reputation across the continent has risen to. Seeing this, he was surprised to say in his head, "I created an epic item and even raised my level." Seeing what had just happened, Smith exclaimed with joy, "It's just incredible to think that a guy who doesn't even look like an assistant can make such an incredible arrow. Aren't you amazing?" Hearing this, Grid shed a few tears and said in disappointment in his head, "I wanted a sword and got an epic arrow." Looking at the boy, the blacksmith said in surprise, "What happened to your face?" Having calmed his disappointment, Grid looked at the object he had created and said in his mind, "Still, among all the existing arrows, there is not a single one that would deal more than 40 units of damage, and sometimes it can completely ignore the enemy's defense." Looking at the arrow he had created, Grid confidently said in his head, "The effect of my class is simply incredible. It is probably better than most one-handed swords of this level." Having created his first work of art, Grid prepared to leave the forge, and seeing this, Smith said, "It's a shame you're leaving." To which Grid replied, "If the stars align, we'll meet again, so don't worry." Before Grid was to leave the forge, he heard Smith say, "I can't keep this wonderful weapon. Take it with you." And the boy received a Jaffa arrow and 3 Jaffa bars. Seeing what he got as a parting gift from the blacksmith, Grid happily said in his head, "He gave me so much as a parting gift because of the high level of relationship between us." And immediately after these thoughts, the boy said, "You took care of me, Mr. Smith. Thank you for that." Hearing these words from the boy, Mr. Smith put the index fingers of both hands together and said awkwardly, "It would be nice if we could live together." Seeing this, Grid nervously exclaimed, "Please don't say such touching things." Throwing all the farewell gifts he had received from the blacksmith on his shoulders, Grid mentally said, "This weight may slow me down. Although the gifts are quite good, the journey to the city will take a long time." Immediately after these words, the boy confidently said, "In any case, I will be able to leave this place as long as I sell arrows." After waving goodbye to the blacksmith who had taught him and helped him get up from the bottom, Grid mentally said, "Wait for me, fighters. I'm Gridnim bringing you some cool stuff." And at the same time, somewhere in the forest where the forest guard lived, he was being raided. The fight was quite intense and many fighters had already died in this confrontation. The boss himself was not alone. He was also helped by the golems he summoned, who also took over and eliminated a large number of fighters who arrived at the raid. However, despite the summoned golems, the group and guild leader used her bow and arrows to easily destroy the stone warriors. With just one shot, she easily destroyed the golems to help her comrades and clear the way for the main boss of this raid. That warrior was Jishuka, the guild master of Sadaka, who fired another arrow at the enemy, saying, "These scoundrels, even after my warning." Trying to help the warriors who were ambushed by golems and had already resigned themselves to death, Jashuka angrily exclaimed, "If you want to live, then move, Tzedakah Guild." One of those present in this battle was the same melee master Ragus, who was a member of the Tzedakah Guild. Also, one of the members of the guild was the same man with whom Grid had encountered on the square. His name was Tobin. There were many strong players in this guild, one of whom was also Vantner, the axe-wielding warrior. Looking at the rest of the mercenaries they were looking for to fight against the forest guard, Jashuka cycled and said in disappointment, almost all of them had already died from ineptitude. After finishing the battle with the enemy, the girl added disappointedly, "Although we dealt with the boss on our own, these guys managed to die from some pettiness." Standing beside the defeated forest guard they had raided, the guild leader heard from one of her comrades that the losses were too great. After a while, when all the survivors gathered in one place, discussions began about how you managed to do it despite the losses and what about the loot. Pulling out the loot from the enemy, Jashuka reported 30 units of black metal, 7 units of orichalcum ore, and 1 unit of blue orichalcum ore. Hearing what they had gotten in the next fight with the boss, Ragus said with a grudging smile, the amethyst shield, which had the slightest chance of falling out, did not appear again. Hearing these words from his comrade, Vantner added confidently, "But at least we got the blue orichalcum. We fought all day and even suffered material losses because of it." When all the discussions between the guild members were over, Jashuka asked one of her subjects, Tobin, how many people had died in this raid against the boss. After counting all the remaining, Tobin lowered his head and awkwardly said 75 people, including the guild members. While the main troops were fighting the boss, the number of golems was increasing, which was a bad factor for us. After hearing the report from her subject, Jashuk gritted her teeth and nervously said in her head, "The difficulty of these interconnected S-rank tasks is much higher than we expected. We need to take some measures." Sitting down on the fountain in the city after they returned from the raid back, Jashuka said disappointedly, "The fourth raid again did not bring any results, and the value of the Forest Guardian is falling among the members. At this rate, the user base in the next raids will decrease significantly." Tzedakah's Guild. This guild is mostly made up of users of fairly high ranks, but due to their small number, their popularity is low compared to their enemies. Before the launch of Satisfy during the LTS era, there were 17 members of the guild, and due to their small number, they always participated in raids with regular players, but even this method had limitations. Hearing that their further raids on the Forest Guard might become more and more difficult, Tobin nervously said, "Without the amethyst shield, we won't be able to continue with the related task, so let's put it aside for now and increase our strength." Hearing the suggestion from his friend Ragus, thoughtfully said, "I don't care as long as I'm on my feet," to which Wantner added, "Let's not rush and wait a bit." After listening to the opinions and suggestions of all her comrades, Jashuka said, "Well then, let's do it." Immediately after these words, the girl confidently said, "Tzedakah's Guild focuses on raising the level of its members and improving equipment for those who do not receive levels in the months ahead." The next moment, Jashuka turned her gaze to Ragus and said, "Rega, you need at least 20 levels." And Wantner said happily, "Too bad, you know her, you're finished."